Record on this computer. So welcome to our brunch, and our speaker is Sage Cole. And so take it away, Sage.
All right, and this is brunch. So we have, how long do we have?
Well, usually we go to 11:30, but
11:30.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to try to share my screen. And let's see. So do you see the main screen? Is that working?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. All right. Well, I thought what I would use today, it's really lovely to be able to do this, because the last time I gave this talk, I think Paige was there. It was in California. So some of this might be familiar to Paige, although I've shaped it a little bit. But before the pandemic, I was ready to head off on a big speaking tour and launch this effort more in a bigger way. And I gave this speech out in Berkeley, and then the pandemic hit 2 months later. And so it's kind of gone underground since then. So anyway, I'm excited to share this. And again, I know this is a little more of an informal setting, so feel free to interrupt as we go along and ask questions or offer your own insights. I do not claim to be a Helen Keller expert by any means, but in 2019, I guess the vision really began in 2018, but then in 2019, it really took off. The idea of creating a Helen Keller Center in Cambridge at the Swedenborg Chapel where I serve. We already wanted to make some changes. The chapel itself is not handicap accessible. So that was sort of a central beginning point, was wanting to make the chapel accessible. And then it was wanting to increase our usefulness in the community, and knowing that Helen graduated from Radcliffe College just across the street from where our chapel lives. It just all has come together as an important vision for our community. So since then, I've been learning about her, but I definitely see myself as a student. So, so this talk I know you all know a lot about Helen, so I'm not going to fill in all the details, but I'm just going to sort of share her story, maybe from a different lens than you've heard it before. So we often, Helen in the global zeitgeist, most people think of Helen at the water pump, and the wonderful, I'm sure many of you have seen The Miracle Worker, this, which is just such a powerful story. And it's something that everybody knows about Helen. And it's so much so that there's a statue of her in the Capitol Rotunda. Actually, you can see, here's some of our legislators unveiling it when it was first put in. I believe it replaced a troubled figure from Alabama that needed to be removed. So this wasn't that long ago. As you can see, Nancy Pelosi's there and Mitch McConnell. It wasn't that long ago that it was put in. So this, this image of Helen is very much stamped in our brains, which is good because it's so powerful, but it's also one of the motivations for the center, is because we know she lived such a huge life after this moment. This was just the beginning. This was just the beginning of her story. And yet, of course, a very powerful one. And Helen thinks of this moment, and she thinks of her time with Annie Sullivan as really a transformative and a kind of a new birth for herself. I have a quote here that she speaks about when she speaks of her teacher. "Once I dwelt in a region of shadows and fears. No one, not even my mother, could communicate with me, and I could not express myself. A double darkness lay upon the face of all things. Then a word dropped into my hand from the fingers of my teacher. A ray of light from her soul set me free, and I found myself, found my fellow men, and God." So this was one of the ways she spoke about her teacher. And specifically, March 3rd, 1887 was the day that she first met Annie Sullivan. And she would talk in her writings and in her journals later about how she'd always honor that day, March 3rd, as her spiritual birthday, because it was the day that she came alive in a new way. That being said, one of the things here's a nice shot of her as a little girl. One of the things that I think is important to think about with the story of Helen is the way that we tell her story. And sometimes, certainly, if you've seen The Miracle Worker, there's the story, you know, the image of the very unruly child, and Anne's kind of coming in and showing her how to behave and how to get along with people, you know, which was so vital and important. But sometimes it's framed as sort of like that Helen, a quote that is attributed to a blind author that she writes somewhat critically of Helen. She says that Annie was the one who worked the miracle, and that Helen was the adversity that needed to be overcome. Sometimes her story is framed in that way. And I think part of what we want to do is tip that a little bit, that Helen was a full-fledged human, that she just needed the tools, you know, to express her inner self. And one of the things to remember about her is that before she met Annie, she actually did communicate. You know, she really lifts up her story of how important Annie was, and she was vitally important. But Helen she had many signs that she used to communicate. She would tie a bonnet under her chin to signify her favorite aunt. She would move her spectacles, her pretend spectacles, to refer to her father. So she developed her own kind of rudimentary sign language so that she could get her needs met and she could be in the world. And I think it's really important to remember she had that feisty spirit. She had all that wisdom. She had everything she needed. She just needed someone to help her channel that. You know, she needed that relationship. She needed that commitment of another person. Another thing to think about in her story, excuse me, is the way that Annie met her. And I find this quote very meaningful. This is from Annie Sullivan, a letter that she wrote. She said, "Her little face wore an eager expression, and I noticed that her body was well-formed and sturdy. For this, I was most thankful. I did not mind the tumbled hair, the soiled pinafore, the shoes tied with white strings. All that could be remedied in time. But if she had been deformed or had acquired any of those nervous habits that so often accompany blindness, and which make an assemblage of blind people such a pitiful sight, how much harder it would have been for me." I think this quote really struck me when I read it. I think it's important to remember how much privilege Helen had. She was beautiful. She was able to live and move in an ableistic culture in a way that was received. And I think it's important to remember how much prejudice still existed at the time, and honestly still exists today, around appearance, habits, all of those things. You know, the life of Helen Keller may very well not have happened had Annie come and found her not to be kind of this jewel that could be presented to the world in a very in a smooth and seamless way. And I think it's just really important to remember this, because part of the challenge of Helen's legacy is she was lifted up and put on such a pedestal that while she did make change for the larger world of disabled people, not as much as she probably would have wished for, because she was sort of lifted up as, oh wow, she's a miracle, she's amazing. But it didn't necessarily translate immediately to, oh, and we should definitely help all children who are disabled and see that they are all miracles and that they all have these gifts. And that's still work that needs to be done. It's actually interesting, Helen, I guess this was when she was still at Perkins School, she wanted to work in a school for other deafblind children. She wanted to start a school for deafblind children and be a part of their education. And she was really dissuaded from that by many of her patrons in the able-bodied community, because they wanted more for her. You know, they didn't want her to waste her life working with a disabled community. They wanted her to be out in the real community. And I think of that often. I think of how different her life would have been and how many relationships she wasn't even really allowed with other disabled people because the able-bodied people around her were so intent on kind of maintaining her image and keeping her sort of set apart from the community of people that were not moving in polite society and were not allowed. And it's a tension that's a part of her story. But all that being said, you know, Annie was a gift to her. Annie was a blessing to her. She committed her whole life to Helen and really did, allow her to have an impact on the greater world that would not have happened otherwise. Pretty soon, they move up to Boston to attend the Perkins School. Up in Boston, they make a splash, they're stars. She ends up meeting lots of very famous figures who become very beloved to her. Alexander Graham Bell here on the left is the one that actually first helps make the connection that she should go up to Perkins, and that, well, actually, no, he's the one who helps make the connection that Annie Sullivan will come down. If many of you probably know, Alexander Graham Bell's wife was deaf, so he was he cared a lot about the deaf community, and he was a great patron of hers. Of course, Mark Twain was a great supporter of hers. Excuse me. She was definitely a celebrity pretty quickly. Another person that she got to meet in her time at Perkins was W.E.B. Du Bois, who was, of course, the first African-American to graduate from Harvard College. He was a student of William James, interestingly enough. And this is the quote from him. He says, "When I was studying philosophy at Harvard under William James, we made an excursion one day out to Roxbury. We stopped at the blind asylum and saw a young girl who was blind and deaf and dumb, and yet who by infinite pains and loving sympathy had been made to speak without words and to understand without sounds. She was Helen Keller. Perhaps because she was blind to color differences in this world, I became intensely interested in her, and all through my life, I have followed her career. Finally, there came the thing which I somehow sensed would come. Helen Keller was in her own state, Alabama, being feted and made much of by her fellow citizens. And yet courageously and frankly, she spoke out on the iniquity and foolishness of the color line. It cost her something to speak. They wanted her to retract, but she sat serene in the consciousness of the truth that she uttered. And so it was proven, as I knew it would be, that this woman who sits in darkness has a spiritual insight clearer than that of many wide-eyed people who stare uncomprehendingly at this prejudiced world." Now, it was a small act in time, but a really powerful act in state or in impact. Helen was from Alabama. Her father was a Confederate soldier. So what she had done is she made a donation of $100 to the NAACP, which was the organization that Du Bois had founded. And she wrote an article. But actually what she did is she sent him a letter supporting their work. And then that letter was published in one of their newsletters. And then word got out. Some very hateful articles were published in her local papers. She never retracted what she did, but that was the last statement that she made. She honored her parents. She was still quite young at the time. And so she honored this didn't become her primary crusading issue. She just kind of spoke the truth of what was happening. And it was very powerful at the time. But now we get into her Swedenborgianism, which is so important to all of us, I know. So this is John Hitz on the right, and then you see him again on the left, kind of next to Helen in the back corner, with Alexander Graham Bell. John Hitz was his kind of right-hand man. He ran the organization that Graham Bell had founded in Washington to support the deaf. So John Hitz was a very important friend to Alexander Graham Bell, and he was the one who introduced Helen to Swedenborgianism. The timing was kind of interesting because Helen had first been very close to Philip Brooks, who some of you may know. He was the pastor of the Trinity Church in Boston, very famous preacher. And he was the first pastor that she went to and spoke with about faith. And Philip Brooks really loved her and just really was interested in the faith that she had, because she hadn't been formally introduced to church. Annie Sullivan herself was pretty anti-religion because of her own upbringing. So she wasn't super keen to be introducing Helen to a religious tradition. Her parents really had no idea how to introduce that to her with the way that she had needed to receive information. So it was it's kind of interesting now, but some of the preachers kind of saw her as like a experimental, like, what does she know about God, having not gotten any information? Like, let's be curious and see her as sort of like a experimental figure. And what Philip Brooks heard is she knew a bit about God. You know, she was able to express that she had a felt presence of something within, that she knew she wasn't alone in her darkness, you know, that she had an inner, you know, I think some people have asked, was Helen a mystic? And I think she definitely had a mystic sense. So Philip Brooks was kind of her pastor, and then he died. And it wasn't long after he died that she became friends with Philip Brooks. This was like her early teen years. And she loved John Hitz dearly. She describes him in her books. I'm sure some of you read him, just a very loving gentleman. And he would talk, she sort of describes him as, they would go on long walks and he would talk about the spiritual world and he would talk about God and nature. And her faith was not taught to her. It was given to her by someone who had a deep faith, which I think is important. It wasn't a teaching. It was very organic. And it was very much about relationship. And then he went and he interpreted Swedenborg's works into Braille and sent them to her. So, I mean, there was a degree of education as well. But it was definitely
shared his faith with her.
He shared his faith, yeah, and he lived his faith. Yeah, he was a loving soul. It's on my list now that the pandemic is waning. There's a archive in Washington that I'm hoping to discover some more letters between the two of them, because I found some, but I know there are more because they corresponded quite frequently, to hear a little bit more about how he taught his faith to her, because I think that will give us some interesting insight. So let's see. Yeah, Helen had said to Reverend Brooks that she'd always known about God even before she had any words. And in her darkness and isolation, she knew she was not alone. Those were the words that she used. But Swedenborg and the Swedenborgian tradition quickly became hers. She embraced it very, very strongly. She wrote about it, as we all know, frequently. Since I was 16 years old, I've been a strong believer in the doctrines given to the world by Emanuel Swedenborg. It was his mission to teach men to listen to the inward voice rather than to opinions and disputations. After many years of reverent study of the Bible, I gratefully wonder if I am not more indebted to Swedenborg for the faith that turns my darkness to light than I have yet realized. And I did find there's a wonderful archive, Helen Keller archive at the American Foundation for the Blind that's accessible. It's all online. And I found a yellow handwritten note of all the things that were at Helen's bedside when she died. And one was her copy of True Christian Religion. So this was not a passing fad. This was her lifelong faith. So it was her lifelong faith. And she never joined any of our churches officially. She did receive communion at the end of her life from the pastor of the New York New Church. She did want to have a new church funeral, which was not allowed by her family. Instead, they had the big service at the National Cathedral. But she never joined the church, but she lived her faith, and she was very devotional, and then she lived this kind of incredible life of activism. Here you see her with JFK. She met so many presidents. And let's just read this quote to start to think about her life of activism. I used to think I should be thwarted in my desire to do something useful, but I have found out okay, I can't remember why. How do we read that?
Typo there.
There's a typo. But I found out that I've thought the ways in which I can make myself useful are few, yet the work open to me is endless. The gladdest laborer in the vineyard may be a cripple. Even should the others outstrip him, yet the vineyard ripens in the sun each year, and the full cluster weighs into his hand. Darwin could work only half an hour at a time, yet in many diligent half hours, he lawed anew the foundations of philosophy. I long to accomplish a great and noble task, but it is my chief duty and joy to accomplish humble tasks as though they were great and noble. It is my service. I'm sorry, your fixed faces are also. How I can best fulfill the demands that each day make upon me, and to rejoice that others can do what I cannot. That's one of her most famous quotes, I think, to the power of small acts.
What's that from, Sage?
That's a good question. Why did I not put that there? I'll get back to you. I'm not exactly sure.
Thank
I don't
you.
know why. So she cared about the world. She wanted to make a better world, and she felt great joy and this great beauty of the world. She had this incredible inner life of that was turned on and enlightened by Swedenborg's vision. You know, she talks about being able to travel in the spiritual world. You know, she knew joy so fully, and yet as she lived in her life, she moved in a lot of high circles with, you know, people who were living their best life. But really, it was during the time that she was in college, she started to see more. You know, college is the time when we start to see more of the fullness of the world. And she would travel in slums, and she could smell that they were different than the parlors that she was in. She could smell the suffering, and she could be with people who were suffering. And she very quickly, just in her innocence and in her open-heartedness and without a lot of the stuff that kind of gets in the way of us just sort of accepting life as it is, she was horrified. This is not how we should, you know, people should not be subjected to this kind of life. The world should be better than this. And we'll talk about this a little more, but I mean, it's hard to say, was this an inner drive first, or what did this come from her faith? But she certainly began to meld the two together. And in her speeches and in her talking, that she often uses very, very religious imagery, the new heaven and the new earth that we are called to live in, and that that there's active effort that needs to happen if that world is going to come to be. And she wanted to participate in this, you know, and this was the early 1900s. This was a time when socialism was very much on the rise. It was in conversations. There were socialist candidates running for things. This was the time of the labor movements and workers' rights. I mean, this was when a lot of the things that today we take for granted came to be, because of the efforts of people fighting for living wage and safe working conditions and all of the other things that at the time were not regulated by any means. This is a picture of her with a group of people protesting, as the Actors Guild, protesting working conditions. And then this is a book that someone put together of some of her speeches. She was an incredible writer and speaker. I wish we had more recordings of her speaking, but she would go to these rallies and she would give profound speeches, even with her difficulty speaking and not always being understood. She was not dissuaded. And she took a stand, a strong political stand for a transformation of how wealth is distributed, so that she believed that there could exist a world where all humans could have their physical needs met and be cared for. What a crazy concept.
Yeah.
And her speeches are just incredible. We are beginning to see the light of a new day. Selfishness has overreached itself and brought destruction upon its own head. Nations have been building vast armies and navies to support a selfish policy, and now they are using the armies and navies. Employers have paid starvation wages until the United States Census Bureau reports that less than half the wage earners in America receive enough to live decently. Women have been forced to toil in mills and children to drudge in factories. Iniquity of the system of selfishness is grown so plain that men are beginning to see that it is a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. So she does not waver from mixing her political views and her faith. She uses very strong religious language in her condemnation of the state of the world at the time.
It sounds like, I think that was pre-World War I, wasn't it?
1916 was about when She did a lot of, it was really speaking to the situation of World War I. Yes, it was very impactful of this. Let us use every weapon that comes to our hands. This is a battle of right against wrong. There is no neutral ground. The cause of industrial democracy is the cause of all the people. It is the cause of peace and justice to all men. It is the cause of God. God is coming with war. It is not the star of peace, but the sound of the 7 trumpets that is leading us into a new age. God is coming with war to cast down the selfishness, the brutality, and the oppression of the strong ones of the earth. Truly, he has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword, and his truth is marching on. I would have liked to be there for that speech. And she could probably give it today, and it would mean nearly exactly the same thing. She was, so all this being said, and this is where a lot of this history of her socialism has been buried, she was a supporter of the Soviet Union. She was a supporter of the communist revolution and all that was happening there. She had a sense of hope that this was going to be what would help to herald in this new day. In the East, a new star is risen. With pain and anguish, the old order has given birth to the new. And behold, in the East, a man-child is born. Onward, comrades, all together. Onward to the campfires of Russia. Onward to the dawn. This is just a little thing so here, if you notice, we had 1916 was when the speeches were. This is from a letter written in 1957, where she wrote a letter to dear Elizabeth Flynn, who was a strong protester who was imprisoned. And so she wrote a letter to her in prison. Loving birthday greetings, dear Elizabeth Flynn. May the sense of serving mankind bring strength and peace into your brave heart. And I mostly note that to note that Helen did not give up her socialism. She made some choices about how to share it so that she could be as useful as possible. But her sentiment and her support of those people who were working for this new world, it never wavered. And it was still, even in 1957, she was still supportive of that drive.
Can I say something, Sage?
Yes, please go.
There's so many things, but one thing that I noticed is that Helen was very aware of the tension between preventing disability and accommodating and serving people with disability. And in her early activist career, she was focused on preventing it. She wanted to overthrow the government. She was a revolutionary. She wanted to make sure that everybody had what they needed. And so a lot of the blindness that happened at that time could have been prevented. Right. And so she said, every time people said, well, let's help the blind, she says, well, let's prevent blindness. And she, her views didn't exactly shift, but they were refined. And I don't know if you're going to talk about the influence of John Macy on her, but
just so John. So John Macy was Anne Sullivan's husband for a time, and he was a Harvard professor. And so during that, we're all radicals in college, right? But hopefully we all stay radicals. But she was definitely, that was a part of her coming into adulthood. John Macy was a strong communist, and so he influenced a lot of that fervor in her, for sure. But again, I think, and I guess I'm not sure if we'll get there, so I'll just say it now. What happened for Helen was, I think she really got clear on what she was able to do. And one of the big parts of her life became working for the American Foundation for the Blind, traveling the world to support efforts to create schools for the blind. And, that was where she really saw she could make a difference. And so that was where she really shifted her energy, is in that direction. And became a little, I think hopefully we don't give up our radical nature, but we kind of learn how to move in society a little better so that we can not scare people, but make change. And I think she saw that she was able to make change with that role much more effectively than remaining kind of a radical.
One thing that fascinated me about the book, Helen and Teacher, was it talked about her making the movie about her life, Deliverance.
Yes,
And
yes.
near the end of the movie, there's a scene where she's riding a horse
Yeah.
and leading the troops to victory.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Joseph Lash observed was that when Helen did that, when she acted that out, she realized that there was a fantasy element to it,
Yeah.
and that she needed to be more realistic in the way
Yeah.
she served humanity.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is sort of how we all hopefully mature and grow. Yeah. Yeah. And she did a lot of really practical things. So these slides are to talk about her feminism a little bit. You know, she was an advocate for the women's right to vote. She wrote a lot of articles about women, why women should be included, not just because they're more pure and better than men, which was sort of the idea at the time, but because they are individuals with their own minds, and should be included in the conversation. One of the things she also did in kind of the role of looking out for women, she started to talk about some venereal diseases that were causing blindness for newborn infants. And people didn't like talking about venereal diseases. We still don't really like talking about it, but she was not afraid to name that, you know, this is something we need to deal with, because it's having this effect on children and causing blindness. So anywhere she was able to see, you know, the cause and the negative effect, she was not afraid to name it and call it out. So this kind of gives you a nice sense of her feminism, which I think is good. So since masculine chivalry has failed us, we must hustle a bit and see what we can do for ourselves and the men who need our suffrage. First of all, we must organize. We must make ourselves so aggressive a political factor that our natural protectors can no longer deny us a voice in directing and shaping the laws under which we must live. We shall not see the end of capitalism and the triumph of democracy until men and women work together in the solving of their political, social, and economic problems. I realize that this is only one of many weapons in our fight for the freedom of, sorry, I need to move your pictures. Anyway, women together will hasten the day when the age-long dream of liberty, equality, and brotherhood shall be realized upon the earth. So yeah, her article, one of her most famous articles, is Why Men Need Women's Suffrage. So she did, and as you can see, her feminism, her efforts for suffrage really were also about economic justice. It always kind of came back to that. And she believed that if women were given the right to vote and given more say in the politics of the world, that that would help to influence more fairness and more care of all. So anyway, these are some pictures of Helen that I particularly love. You know, I guess as a feminist, she was never married. She lived in the company of women. So this was also kind of a radical act at the time. Of course, she was dissuaded from being married because of her disability, which is another kind of sadness and harm. She actually tried to elope with a young gentleman who loved her and who we imagine she loved. And Annie Sullivan was very much against it, as was Helen's mother, from the relationship. So it's part of her story. It's, you know, certainly today we hope to support people with disability living the fullest life possible. But this was still a time of a lot of conflicted feelings about people with disability, whether they should procreate, whether it was safe for them to raise children, have families, all of those things. And I don't think we'll ever know the full story, you know, if this was something it seems like she wanted this, but her devotion to Annie was very strong. And it was almost like it was a sacrifice that she accepted, and it didn't hang over her life. She realized, okay, this isn't something I'm going to get to have in my life, and she moved on. So I guess I would just share a couple more things about her bigger life. So as I'm so sorry, it's Lori Odner. Lori was mentioning that she sort of softened her views a little bit. She became an ambassador for the American Foundation for the Blind. And this is where we see all of the wonderful pictures of her traveling the world and great crowds of people welcoming her to Japan and other parts of the world. She really was like a global celebrity. And on those trips, she acted as an ambassador for the blind, but also really for the United States. And this is where she had the chance to meet so many different presidents. Everyone loved her. So she was a really great ambassador, especially through through a world war. And then after Hiroshima, she was one of the first people to revisit, and I wish I had the picture here, but she was one of the first to visit the scene of the nuclear bomb afterwards. There's just a beautiful picture of her with her, not Annie. Annie had died at the time, but and she describes it. She describes it very eloquently, the feeling of death in that place. So in that way, she becomes also an incredible advocate for peace in the world. So these are the different areas of advocacy that we have kind of lifted up as particularly poignant for Helen. Economic justice was her most radical stance, and it really was the foundation of a lot of her thinking, that if there was more justice, fewer people would be becoming disabled in the first place. People would have the resources they need to thrive. Disability rights obviously was kind of her niche, and that was where she was able to make the most of an impact. And that was in her work with American Foundation for the Blind. That was what she spent really the second half of her life doing, traveling the world to encourage countries to care for their disabled communities. We talked a little bit about her feminism. Peace, again, comes through in her early speeches against selfishness and war. War is also, war is more than, war includes all of these atrocities. War creates economic injustice, and it creates all of these other problems. And we often sort of see her as a peace activist, because that was definitely that was the frame she stood in towards the end of her life and towards the later years of her life. Someone standing up for international relations and community. And by being an ambassador to these different countries, she did help to bring the world together. She wouldn't have called herself an anti-racist, but we did talk about the one experience with the boys. And she did work later on in her career with AFB to support more creation of schools for the blind for children of color, because of course this was still the time of segregation, and there were still huge inequities within the disability community between who was getting support and who was not. And then for the center, I want to lift up creation care. Again, during her life, environmental justice was not yet a term. We were sort of still living in a time where we believed that the earth would have unlimited resources and it would just all be fine. But I certainly believe if she were alive today, and certainly later in her life, she speaks to this a little bit more. But her faith gave her an incredible love of the natural world, or vice versa. Chicken and the egg, right? But she cared about the world, and she cared about its beauty. And there's some nice quotes about her talking about, what is an incredible new building compared to a 200-year-old tree, or just the way that our efforts to create the landscape are so futile compared to God's efforts and all that he has created. So I guess those are all my screenshots. There's a lot I didn't cover, so why don't we stop here and hear like questions, comments. We can have more of a discussion at this point. And hi, Missy. Anybody have a comment or question about Helen you want to talk about?
Yes, please. If I don't want to get in front of everybody else, but
go for it.
I did want to go back to the time when Helen and Annie and John lived together at Rentham.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
John came there to be a secretary and an editor, and so the three of them became a really great team for writing.
Yeah.
Like Annie was her prime communication avenue. But then John was able to, type things up and edit things and bounce ideas off of them. And so it was a very wonderful creative collaboration. And when you think about it, it was so tragically short that, Annie was not an easy person to be married to, and neither was John. And they couldn't get along. And how much Helen missed John after he left. He was the one that she bounced ideas off in terms of developing her socialist views. And
Annie was much more conservative.
Even though Annie was very rebellious about what happened to her as a child, but she was much more conservative, and she wasn't in favor of women's suffrage or socialism. And I don't know if people realize how Russian communism was seen as a beacon for the future. People were all looking toward Russia and saying, this is the future. This is the kind of government that's going to create, everybody's going to thrive. And then, things happened. People were elected. World War I went the way it did. And people realized that this wasn't about to happen. And people just had to kind of deal with things the way they were. But then, so to me, it's fascinating to watch Helen's mental development through that time and see how she said, okay, well, we're not going to overthrow the government. So what can we do now?
What's next? Well, and they had to make a living, right? Annie and Helen had to find a way to
make a living.
survive.
They went on the vaudeville circuit.
Exactly.
I saw some footage of that. It was really interesting. Also, just one thing I wanted to add was I saw a picture of Helen visiting wounded soldiers during World War II, and it was Annie's biographer Nella Bratty who suggested, why don't you go visit the soldiers? And she's like, that's a great idea. And it was such a wonderful thing because she was a living embodiment of someone who had faced adversity and overcome it. And the soldiers loved her, they idolized her. And she described it as the crowning experience of her life.
Right. Giving them some hope that you can still be a useful, capable human in the world, even if you have a missing body part.
Sprung from the fact that she was who she was.
For sure. Thank you. Yeah.
By the way, I can't get her name.
Sue, did you have something? Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Saying, my wife's name is Linda.
Linda, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
That's okay. Linda, thank you. Sue, did you want to say something?
I at one point I remember finding an article. I believe it might have been in a messenger about her peace advocacy in World War I. Have you seen such an article?
I mean,
try to think of where it was. But anyway, it was very interesting. I mean, she was really against World War I.
Yeah. Well, she spoke at one. So she spoke at two of our conventions for the Swedenborgian Church. It might have been
a report of one of the speeches.
And the very first speech that she gave was her first speech was very much about the soldiers dying and talking about them crossing over into the spiritual world and kind of what this transition had meant.
Right.
And
that must be the one.
Her second speech was a little bit more critical of convention, but her first speech was very much talking about the war and what this war, what all this death kind of was meant for us, and for all of these soldiers crossing over. Yeah. And she was one of the, that was also the time in history when the idea of angels, the idea of people who had entered the spiritual world, that we could still, love, that they were still active and still kind of connected to us, became more of a popular idea, which isn't so surprising as so many people were dying. And I think her speech and some of her efforts kind of added to that, where our Swedenborgian notion that we take so for granted really began to be more of a popular a way of thinking. Yeah.
It was in the Civil War too.
In the Civil War too, that's true. Or what's happened.
Every wartime, and I'm thinking about now.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. Yeah.
We see the fragility of the line between this world and the next world. Yeah. Any other comments or things you want to talk about? Questions? Go. I forget
Liz?
people. So,
Okay, Liz.
thank you.
I would like to ask, does your center have any thoughts or Helen Keller informed comments about the recent situation with political protesting? Because I see it just seems like it's getting harder and harder. You can be deplatformed and debanked, and like in Canada, they can freeze your bank account now with no warrant, like,
Oh, wow.
and stuff like that. Like, I just feel like we're not in the same days where you can just hold up a sign and, get your point across in some ways. There's like a lot of more sophisticated ways that various corporations and organizations will use to, curtail speech that they don't like. And I know for a lot of people, they see that just as, oh, that's like a conservative issue. But I know liberals protest more than anyone. So I feel nervous even when I see that used on like truckers or something, because I feel like that could be my good cause next time. And I wondered if your organization was making any statements or doing anything to encourage the freedom to be an activist.
Right. That's a very good point and good question. My organization at this point is like me and all of you, because we're talking about this right now. We're not really we're not so established yet. We're still in that process. What I would share is, it's, as I mentioned, I was ready to launch this thing, in 2019, and then the pandemic hit, and now we've been walking through this pandemic for 2 years. And so a lot of those a lot of the practical efforts had to be put on hold. But I would share that on a spiritual level, everything that's happened in these last 2 years, kind of naming all of us kind of being awoken again to the reality that, essential workers have to put themselves at risk just because of their job, and the way in which our safety is very much based on our skin color or where we live and how much money we make. And I don't know, I personally think Helen has been doing some work from the spiritual world these last 2 years. I think she'd be all about a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement, and, the efforts that have been made to start to name more of the problems in the world. So I only say that in that I haven't made any statements. The center hasn't made any statements, but I think Helen's making some statements. I think we're actually in a better place now to be establishing the center, because a lot of the things that she saw as problems in her lifetime are now kind of again on the table. They're on the table again to say, hey, what is goodness? What is truth? What is our call as human beings to care for each other? And sometimes some of her speech has been seen as naive, because especially a lot of those big speeches that were before the World War and before all of these things. But it's still ultimately about love, right? Like, it still is ultimately about sometimes like the simplest, these simple values of creating a world built on love. And yes, we know that communism didn't work out like we hoped in Russia, and like certain things didn't unfold. But does that mean we shouldn't try anymore? Does that mean that it's worth giving up the fight, to really reach out and lift up the humanity and the worthiness of all people? So I didn't really answer your question, but I think that those are the questions we need to be asking. And that's partly why I wanted the center to come to be. Yeah. Robin, do you have something?
Oh, Liz's question made me think about that too. So my question is the organization intending to be politically vocal, or is it really just going to be strictly an education center?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting time. I don't know if any of you have watched my YouTube video on Thursday when it was actually Helen's spiritual birthday, but I these last 2 years have really changed my thinking about that. Originally, full disclosure, I came to Cambridge in 2015 to a very small, nearly dead community. We were pretty much ready they were like, we could maybe pay you for 2 years, was kind of the word I got when I got there. And it's 7 years later and I'm working full time and everything's going okay. So we've been through an amazing change and transition. When I first got there, it was like, I don't know what's going to happen to the church, but I bet we could make a center here that could really have an impact and that could be in these bigger conversations with other disciplines. And I saw them as very separate. As of Thursday and for this next year, I'm in a discernment period and our community's in a discernment period about whether or not we can create a resonance between the two. Because I'm not really called to be the director of a center. I'm called to be the leader of a church. That's what I care about. And so I don't know. I don't have an answer to that, Robin. This is a year of discernment and thinking about what it means to be a church, what it means to preach the good news, what it means to gather in community, what it means to receive this new heaven and new earth. You know, I think all of those questions are on the table and we're really taking a very open-minded stance at that this year to be in discernment about whether or not something new could be born that brings the two together. So, you know, I want to do all the things. And I hope we can do all the things in Harvard. It's a pretty powerful point in the world to have an impact because of the educational centers around there. And I think one of my dreams is, you know, I know there's complications with bringing politics and religion together. I mean, I know that's all very touchy territory for all kinds of reasons. But at the same time, I don't know that it should be political or touchy or challenging to say, how do we create a more loving world? Like that to me should be what church is about. How do we be more loving together? And how do, you know, and I don't know, it's my hope and prayer that something will emerge that can be grounded in faith, grounded in religious practice and community, but also that can actively explore these big ideas from different perspectives, you know, because people are trying to answer this question in all kinds of different areas of study, right? Sociologists and teachers, and we're all trying to like do better. And I don't know, I have kind of a vision or a hope that the center could be a place where some of those conversations could happen between different people of different perspectives. And that Helen is just a great example of being able to hold all of those things, that they don't have to be a part of that a lot of good can come from. Maybe we have more in common than we think. And if we start from love and having a, you know, trying to do that better, you know, I don't know what's going to come. So this is a year of asking and questioning, and I honestly don't know where it's all going to unfold, but I'm very grateful that our church has gotten to a place where people are we have a lot of love in our little community, even though it's a small one, and there's a lot of, and people are really willing to trust me, to trust God, to trust what's unfolding. And so we're taking a year of experimenting to see what it will all look like in the end. Anybody else?
I think Paige has her hand up.
Yeah. On that score, Sage, I just attended a 4-week session where Methodist ministers in Eastern Pennsylvania did a book study, and I just put it in the chat, of Keiko Tan's Being the Church in a Post-Pandemic World. And that might be useful as you go through this discernment.
Yeah.
And then there's another book I was just going to put on, which is called Removing the Pews in Church.
Lovely, thank you.
The Keiko Tan's view is that you're a church that's situated where it's situated.
Yeah.
Therefore, you are to be the spiritual home and the critical element in that community. You need to serve both the people outside the church and the people inside the church. She calls it those who are already churched and those not yet churched. And to go through a discernment period she has a whole bunch of questions to have people consider of what that means. And some of the, which means, becoming more relevant in the world, if you will.
Yeah.
And some of the questions are, what percent of your budget is spent on the Sunday worship versus the rest of the rest of your ministry? Percent of your budget is spent on maintaining your building. And what to think about what you're renting your building out for, which many churches are now doing. Is this integral to your mission, or is it renting space for daycare? Do you use that daycare operation as a means to reach out to the people in the community, like offering a Friday night supper that they can take home? Things like that.
It's a time to be asking those questions, for sure.
Quite provocative. And then of course the moving the pews. We're in my Methodist church, we're kind of looking at that. We're having a church that had beautiful Tiffany stained glass windows, and a lot of money trying to keep them up. And we have to change the floor because I'm not sure what's carpet and so forth, but is this an opportunity to refit? And they had examples of churches that have moved the pews and have versatile seating. That's led to a whole, just to much more. So anyway, I just
thank you for that recommendation. I'll put that down. And I know for me, I think another piece, and this is where Helen is just becoming more and more relevant to me, is I think what happened in the pandemic for me was a break where now I'm really good at being in the present, and I'm really good at thinking about like 500 years down the line, but I have like no interest in the little details of how to maintain what we're doing now. I think it's time to think 500 years down the line. Like what I think we're at a time of incredible change in the world, and that this vision of a new church that Swedenborg was pointing to is more relevant than ever, of like how will we carry one another through what I see are going to be incredible changes over these next, 100 years, if we're going to be able to survive on this planet, basically. That there are incredible challenges ahead, and how do we come together? How do we create that sense of connection and community and faith that can help us to weather all of that? So that's where my mind is a lot. And I think Helen's mind was kind of there, I think, that in her speech. And so I'm kind of getting radicalized again in mid-age. And I hope I can manage to continue to operate in polite society. But I think it's time to ask these big questions, and I think for a church like mine that was so close to the end, we're just perfectly situated for that. We have nothing to lose. We were almost ready to close up shop. So it's time. It's just time to really be open-minded, I think, and I'm really excited about thinking about Swedenborg's, where he was pointing versus looking so closely at him. I think we've been spending a lot of time gazing at him and all of the things he thought, and he thought some really great stuff, and he saw some really amazing things. But the thing he really wanted us all to listen to was about this new church, and that's what we're trying to do. That's why we're ministers, right? Is to be this new church, and I'm not convinced that we've gotten it all figured out yet. I think there's probably more to be revealed on what this new church might be, and I'm excited to consider new ideas. Is that Joanne?
Yeah, Joanna.
Joanna, thank you.
You were talking about where to look, and I haven't read Helen's essay in a few years, How I Would Help the World.
Yeah.
But it might be good to look at her words.
Oh, sure.
There. She is outlining how she would help the world. I mean, so when I write this article, I'll be revisiting those words, but I was just thinking, she's already written out where we need to be going. And it's all about love and reading Swedenborg and being aware of the spiritual world. But that might be a place to start in terms of.
For sure. For sure. Yeah, for sure. It's such an interesting thing to be looking at her who, lived her faith outside of the bounds of an organization. Swedenborg, who was not attached to an organ, he had the foundation of a Lutheran upbringing, but he was having a singular mystical experience outside of the bounds of a church community. So to have these two kind of leaders, whatever you want to say, but then be a minister trying to create a church community. It's very interesting juxtaposition, because they're different efforts. How do we create church community that then can make space for people like Swedenborg and Helen to thrive and live their amazing lives? Communities that nurture courage and diverse ways of thinking. Sometimes the church becomes a place of focusing our thinking, and sometimes we need that, but then we also need times of opening and expansion. And that's a big challenge for a church to hold all of that at the same time. Yeah. Thanks, Joanna. Usually Zoom tells me people's names, but I don't have that feature on right now.
Sage, I had a question.
Sure.
And you sort of answered it actually in answering Joanna's question. But one is, I know that Helen Keller did not officially join any Swedenborgian churches, but she certainly interacted. If you could say something about the ways that she did that, and why, if you have any theories on why it is that as Swedenborgians we don't know. I'll speak for myself, have only recently heard about her amazing activism. Yeah. Mainly it was all about her Swedenborgianness.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're always interested in our own perspective. And Helen has one of the most, I think, she lived such an incredible life and she did so many things. It's easy to just take one part and focus on that. She was this woman of faith and devotion. She was an activist. She was on vaudeville. She was, she did a lot of things. So I'm not that surprised. And I think while we as Swedenborgians know about our Swedenborgianism, the larger world doesn't know about that. I don't know if any of you saw recently, PBS did a new documentary of her called Becoming Helen Keller. It's lovely, and it speaks about her activism. It says not one word about her Swedenborgianism, not one sentence, the whole thing. My congregation is very upset about that. And I am too, and that's partly why we want to create this center. So her life has been really picked apart to serve different needs and to speak to different people. Clearly the most, the part we know the most about is her childhood. But I think to make her palatable to different communities, and perhaps, maybe there's negative parts of that, but there's also positive. And that's one of the reasons so many people know about her. And she had such a big impact, is she could be received with these different lenses of experience. But I don't know the inner, I'm still sort of searching for that one journal entry that's going to say why she'd never joined a church. It could have been for very practical reasons, because of Annie and her disdain for church going. I don't know. I don't have any evidence that she ever came to Swedenborg Chapel, even though she went to Radcliffe in 1903. The chapel was built in 1901. The seminary was right next door. You would have thought that she would have had some reason to interact with that community at some point. She was firmly connected to John Hitz at this point. Her Swedenborgianism was secure, but I don't have any evidence to that fact. So I honestly don't really know what her thinking was behind it, other than I imagine, to be a Swedenborgian was part of her radicalness. Her family was certainly not supportive of that part of her life. So it may also have just been a political move to, and this was also a time when there's the general church and there's convention. I know very little about her connections to the general church, but I know that there was probably some reaching out from there as well. So maybe she just decided not to get in the mess and not pick sides. I don't know. It was Reverend Clayton Priestnell, who was the pastor in New York, who did finally give her communion towards the end of her life, and they had somewhat of a relationship. But again, yeah, not the official sign on the dotted line.
I know that she visited Swedenborgian churches, not the general church, but Swedenborgian churches in Australia when she went there to visit. She gave that speech in Brisbane, and she did address convention once that I know of. You guys might know the exact date, you and Susan. I don't really know, but so I know she had some public sort of interaction with.
She did.
So
yeah, and if you go on the American Foundation for the Blind archive, you'll find lots of letters of request from Swedenborgians asking her to go to things and her saying no, which is not that surprising. I mean, she had lots of requests for lots of things, but I think the group at the British conference invited her to some stuff. And, so, I mean, there were a lot of, conversations, connections between the authority of the church and Helen. And yes, she spoke at convention twice.
I think I saw in our Ohio Association meeting minutes historically that she lost some of her Swedenborg books, I think, in a fire. And the Lady Society in the Ohio region was going to buy her a couple books, but convention upped them and decided to buy her a whole set. And I was going to try and find a copy of that if you don't have that and send it to me.
I would love that. And you also lent her the gold bust of Swedenborg, right? So that she could touch it.
Urbana University loaned her the bust of Swedenborg so she could feel what he looked like.
Oh, his face looked like.
I sent you that article, didn't I?
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I mean, it really comes down to membership. I mean, I know a lot of people who are very connected to our church who haven't signed on the dotted line yet either. I mean, it's like sort of important and then sort of not that important, because she certainly was very involved and connected and supportive of the church.
Well, speaking as a soon-to-be former general church member, I would imagine that that the general church was not comfortable with her radicalism, her activism, her socialism, her feminism. Those are just hot button issues right down the line. Difficult. I mean, the general church hasn't been big on helping people get out of poverty or supporting women's rights. It's just not a good fit.
It's just part of the politics, right? And that's that's why I think it's just a cool time to think about what would be a good. I want to serve a church that Helen Keller would want to be a part of. What would
Helen Keller do?
What church would she want to come to? Yeah, and that's some of the sadness of religious institutions, is the way that they sometimes have actually, not been able to support these deeply faithful people. Yeah,
I think the Keiko Tan's book will be really.
Yeah, sounds great.
I also put another one up for some people. Recently joined the Third Act organization, which is a group that Bill McKinnon started for those of us in our senior years in the third life, and how to be active with other generations, younger generations in particular.
That's wonderful. Well, and that's one of the things that keeps me holding to the church, is the intergenerational quality of the church, that it isn't something you get everywhere. There's something so profound about that. Yeah, that's awesome. Did you say Bill McKinney or Bill McKinnon? McKinnon, okay.
When you were talking about her Swedenborgianism not being very known, I reminded me that I feel the same way about John Chapman.
Sure.
And that we could do something more with that. I mean, fresh news straight from heaven. How can we not have speaker series of fresh news straight from heaven? It's just like somebody waiting to pick up on that, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Any other questions or thoughts about Helen?
Thank you very much for
Well,
Thank
you so
you.
much, Stacey.
feel like-
It's such a pleasure.
You were also new areas, so thank you.
Oh, good. I'm not that, I'm sick this week, so I feel like my head isn't that clear. I know there's many more stories I could be telling you and they're not quite coming to mind, but it's just the beginning. The center is just getting started. I might encourage you, we do have a mailing list called Helen's Circle that you can sign up for. I'll put the website in the chat. Not many emails have been coming out during the pandemic because I have 2 small children, and so things have been on hold, but we are picking things up again, and we have received a $2 million pledge from the Massachusetts New Church Union for the center, which is very exciting. The plans we have for the building require $10 million, so we only need 8 more. No biggie.
$1 million.
So we're making progress, and that's all I can hope for. And I feel like the speed is actually okay. I mean, things in churches don't move quickly, right? That's ridiculous. They have to move slowly, just to catch everybody up. And I'm excited to be taking this year to keep moving slowly. You know, post-pandemic, there's such a compulsion or a feeling, a need to like jump back into things, you know, get back to things. And I'm really actively trying to resist that urge and trying to go back to things that have meaning and heart, to reflect on what we've all been through, so that we can really, I think there's just, you know, Swedenborg said, what chaos is when everything gets ripped apart so that it can come back into a more perfect order. And I think that's what happened. And this is a time to be, to just, be thoughtful and faithful. Nobody needs to rush. You know, nothing is urgent about the state of the church at the moment. Everyone's okay. So it's more about the future and answering these really big questions.
You know, there's one thing I wanted to add that may sound like it's not relevant to what we're talking about now, but I think it is. That is, I actually looked up Laura Bridgman, who was, you've heard, she's sort of the person who made Helen Keller possible in a way, because she was the first person that Samuel Ridley Howe taught the manual language to, and she learned to communicate. And, you know, I looked up her life, and it's very sad because she didn't have really an Annie Sullivan to be with her. She was repeatedly abandoned in her life. And even Laura Bridgman, who was relatively, you know, lucky and privileged. Just the fact that she was so disabled made her life so much more difficult. Like she had so much grief about her lack of human connection that there were times during her life she refused to eat. And it's just, you know, we think of her as like John the Baptist compared with Helen Keller being Christ, but you know, she was a person too, and she was a hurting person. And I think that's relevant to all that we're talking about here.
It's totally relevant. And that's where, I mean, I don't know where this is all going, but the foundational idea is we're putting people with a disability at the center, that we're, all of us could be disabled tomorrow. I mean, the human life is fragile and our bodies are not superhuman, and the ideal body is not this one body and we're all trying to get to it. You know, we're all different and we have different needs. And there's something very powerful about leaving, you know, putting that at the center of the story versus the image of perfection or the image of holiness. But just, there's so much hurting and so much need. And if we can acknowledge that someone with, you know, deep physical needs or is worthy of human contact and worthy of life and worthy of joy, and we can do what we need for that person, then everyone will do it for everybody. You know, it's like we have to start there. Yeah.
I'd just like to thank you.
Well, and thank you as well, and know that you're a part of this. This is something, you know, Faith, Paige, you brought up, you know, that a church serves its community, and that is certainly true. And I care about what's happening in Cambridge, and that's vital. And I guess as Swedenborgians, we're all pretty connected. I mean, if anyone says they meet a Swedenborgian, I'm like, I probably know them. We're all connected, we're little, so we need each other. And I do see the Swedenborg Chapel, whatever is happening with the Helen Keller Center, as being a mission that can be shared by everybody. And it doesn't have to be just convention or general church. It's the Swedenborgian movement. It's Helen's movement. It's bigger than any one organization. And so I hope you'll all feel a part of what's happening, because I certainly can't do it by myself. I think God is doing something. What I'm trusting this year, and what I've seen these last 2 years, is God has continued to do the work even when I can't, and when I'm sick, or when I have to be with my kids. And so I would just ask all of you to keep listening and feeling and looking for how God is working in you. And if you feel any impulses to jump in, offer your wisdom, your love, whatever to this project, do not hesitate, because it's
I really think it does have a lot of applications. Like, there's so many people now who feel they have things to say, or they want to be influencers. Like, if there would be, and most of us are not, very attractive, or, very like, we don't have special things about us that would recommend us to be public speakers, but maybe there would be some Helen Keller informed ways of like training people, especially if you come from a culture that doesn't see you as, maybe on the level of the, establishment straight white men who get to talk about stuff all the time. Like, it would be super great to have something to encourage people to get their perspective out there in a loving and good way.
Yeah. Well, again, this is all just a vision at this point. It's not a reality, but one of the central ideas of this year of discernment that I imagine is I want to hear people's stories, and I want to encourage us to tell each other our stories. We look to the word as God's word, and as containing this inner story of regeneration, of the Lord's glorification. And I think that story is playing out not just in the Bible, but in all of our lives. And so I do sort of imagine some way to, like, for us all to be influencers. I don't know, for us all to tell our own stories of regeneration, of God, of, how we have come to know God, know love, like that there's something very powerful in that. And maybe there's things we'll learn about what this new church needs to be from one another. So that's another way any of you could help, is if any of you feel like you have a story, a special story of your own experience of God, or your own experience of, like, any experience you have that you could describe, you came to know something true about life, about God, about why we're here. Those are powerful stories. And I've been realizing that's like the best part about being a minister, is people tell you those stories. But like, I think other people could probably benefit from them too. Like, so I'm trying to encourage and collect more stories from people just like yourself. So if any of you want to be involved in that project, or if you can think of amazing people, especially elders who might not be with us on this plane forever, who have stories to tell, I'm trying to encourage kind of a building a network of that storytelling within my Cambridge community. But I would love it if it went beyond just our group in Cambridge.
Thanks.
Yeah, because there are a lot of influencers out there, aren't there? Telling their stories with abandon, but maybe there's some deeper ones that could be useful as well.
Well, thank you, Sage, so much. We're at 11:30, so we'll probably wrap.
Awesome.
And
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Good to see you all.
Since I had this sound on my earpods, I had this awful fear that maybe the audio won't be connected to the video when in the recording. Anyway, we'll see what happens with that. But also wanted to say we don't actually have a plan for next month for brunch. I'm not sure if we'll be meeting in person or on Zoom. I kind of like the Zoom thing because we can get Sage and back-end people, but if we go back to in person, we'll probably just be limited to who can show up. But anyway, I'll be in touch with everyone and give me your ideas for what you want to do for next month. And thank you, Sage. It was wonderful.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate being with you. It's been wonderful.
Right.
Okay.
See you again soon. All right. Bye, friends.